Everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and this week we are going to talk about korbanot offered by non-Jews. Why? Because it's fascinating, right? A few of the mishnayot in the fifth parak of Menachot, and a mishnah, at least so far, that we've learned in the sixth parak of Menachot, have mentioned the concept of minchat goyim, a flower offering offered by non-Jews, and it opens up the question of non-Jews giving sacrifices at the Beit Hamikdash. Now, in the Beit Hamikdash. Now, why do I think this is an interesting question? And then, of course, we have a Gemara that goes back and forth and gives us some machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Akiva. We'll get to that. But the reason why I think this is interesting is because we have these psukim in Tanakh that actually indicate that, the Beit Hamikdash is going to be a place for all peoples. But we also have psukim that indicate that it was important that the Jews themselves are the only ones to build the Beit Hamikdash. And of course, what I'm talking about is, the famous pasuk in Yeshayahu Nun Vav, Yeshayahu 56, "V'haviotim el har kadshi, v'simachtim b'veit tfilati, elotem v'zivchem l'ratzon al mizbechi, ki veiti beit tefila yikarei l'chol hamim." Right? I'm going to bring everyone to my Mikdash, and this is going to be a place where olotehem v'zivchehem, their burnt offerings and their peace offerings, right? Remember, burnt offerings burnt completely on the Mizbeach. Zivchayim probably refers to shlamim, right? Probably refers to peace offerings. We're partially eaten by the people who bring it, partially by the Kohanim, partially by the Mizbeach. So you have a pasuk like that is very universalist, and then you also have, and by the way, you have examples, and I put it on the source sheet. You have examples like from Divrei Yamim Bet that actually describes people bringing some sort of non-Jewish kings or non-Jewish representatives bringing korbanot to the Beit Hamikdash or sending korbanot to the Beit Hamikdash. We, of course, know the famous story of Kamsa bar Kamsa, where the Roman emperor sends a korban to be given in the Beit Hamikdash, but sends it with there's a mum that ends up being put in it. There's a blemish, and they're not really sure. So you definitely have Tanakh and then also some Chazalic stories that describe an ability for non-Jews to bring a korban. But you also have, for example, Ezra chapter 4, where the Shomernim, the Samaritans, want to build the Beit HaMikdash with the Jews, and the Jews say, nope, that's not for you, that's for us to build. So I think it's just an interesting question, how particularistic, how universalistic, especially if we're thinking from a monotheistic perspective, that this is supposed to be the temple that represents God's presence on earth. Then certainly you should have a way for people who are non-Jewish to be able to give a korban. At the same time, there's certainly a sense of Jewish particularism in the Beit HaMikdash, of a special relationship, a special covenant between God and the Jewish people. So I want to start by actually looking at a few of the Tannaitic sources, meaning sources in Mishnah, sources in Tosefta, sources in Midrash Halakha, describing what kind of korbanot a non-Jewish person can give to the Beit HaMikdash and what kinds not, and then ultimately get to our Gemara, which discusses a machloket about this between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So what we want to do is try to understand the why of different positions and what they are trying to express. So let's start with our Mishnah in Menachot, on which the Gemara is saying things, which is the Mishnah in chapter 6, Mishnah Aleph, right? And it's discussing which Menachot get kmitza, right? They get a handful of flour removed from them, and then the rest are going to be ultimately eaten by the Kohanim. And one of those mentioned, as we said before, is minchat goyim, which makes it sound like certainly a non-Jew can give a korban mincha. A non-Jew can give a flour offering. Now, and by the way, a flour offering that is going to be eaten, part of it at least, by the Kohanim. So it sounds like what we're talking about here is a voluntary offering, right? great, you can bring a voluntary offering. Now, when you go to the Mishnah in Shkalim, the Mishnah in Shkalim, first chapter, Mishnah Hay, tells us explicitly that non-Jews are allowed to give donations, voluntary korbanot. Okay, so it starts with, because the Mishnah in Shkalim is about gathering money to pay for korbanot tzibur, to pay for public korbanot. It starts with, or this is the middle of the Mishnah anyway, but for us, our excerpt starts with ha'oved kochavim ba'akuti, a pagan and a kuti, right? Kutim were this sort of, Samaritan, I shouldn't say it, Kutim were this sort of, they weren't Jewish, but they kept some Jewish rituals. Okay, we say that they were Gerei Arayot. They converted to Judaism out of fear of lions, and the question of we basically say they didn't actually become Jews, but they keep some Jewish rituals, notably matzah, for example. But either way, either of this, whether a person is a pagan or is clearly a monotheist, but not Jewish, a shaklu, who decided to give shkalim also, they decided to give a machatzira shekel, they decided to give a half shekel to the Beit Hamikdash, in mekablin miyadan. We don't accept it from them, right? They cannot give to that. And not only that, ve'ein mekablin miyadan, kinei zavin, v'kinei zavot, v'kinei yodot, v'chataot, v'ashamot. Okay, and we also don't accept, basically, this is a list of required korbanot, right? They cannot give required korbanot, right? So if they were a zav, if they had a seminal emission that was irregular, they can't give the korban for that. If they were a zava, a woman's bleeding emission that is irregular, they couldn't give for that. If they were a yoledet, a woman gave birth, she couldn't give for that, right? And by the way, for people who are not familiar with kinim, kinim with a kuf is a pair of birds. We have a masachet kinim, right? They can't give a chatat, a sin offering. They can't give an asham. They can't give a guilt offering. So what can they give? Aval nedarim unedavot mikablim miyadam. But they can give donations, right? They can give neder, I swear to give X, or they can give a nedava, this thing is donated to the Mikdash as a korban. Now, it seems like they can't even donate the korban of a yoledet if they gave birth. So the Mishnah adds, Zeh haklal, here's the rule. Kol shenidar v'nidav, anything that can be given by oath to the Mikdash or can be donated, mekabli miyada, we accept from them. Meaning, a person can't just donate a korban of yoledet if they didn't give birth, right? It's not something that you can just donate, so therefore you wouldn't be allowed to do that. Kol she'ein nidar v'nidav, anything that cannot be simply donated at will, any korban, ein mekabli miyadan. We don't accept it from them. And then v'cheinu mifarash al yidei Ezra, and this is made explicit by Ezra, and this is Ezra chapter 4 that I was referring to before, Shinemar, as it says, Lo lachem v'lanu livnot es Beit Elokeinu. We are not going to build the Beit Hamikdash with you. The Samaritans later become known as the Kutim in rabbinic literature. The Samaritans who wanted to build the Beit Hamikdash with the Jews said no. Now, what this is essentially saying is, first of all, it's giving you a logic for why, if they're giving shkalim, we won't accept those shkalim from them. They're giving shkalim to the Beit HaMikdash, we won't accept them. But it seems essentially what we're saying is, this is not a house where you give the same required korbanot that we give. You give maybe donations to it, but essentially it is our house. Now, I want to take us to where this concept is coming from. And I want to take us to where this concept is coming from. Okay, and it seems like it comes from Vayikra chapter 22, which if you learn the Gemara on Ayin Bet, Amud Bet, and Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, you definitely looked at these psukim, but I want to look a little closer. Vayikra Kaf Bet, Psukim Yud Zayin and Yud Chet. We'll start with those. Okay, by Deber Shem Moshe Lemor, God spoke to Moshe saying, Daber el Aharon ve'el banav ve'el kol bnei Israel. Speak to Aaron, speak to his children, speak to his sons, and speak to all of the children of Israel, and say to them, Ish mi Beit Israel. any person from the house of Israel, umin hager b'Yisrael, and from, and of course, rabbinic literature reads this as convert, although in the Bible itself, in the Torah itself, ger seems to mean somebody who's not Jewish, who is a monotheist, but that is not the way Chazal read this pasuk, right? Asher yakriv korbano, who gives their korban, lechol nidrehem ulechol nidvotam, for all of what they swear, right, upon themselves to give, or all of the donations that they make, right? The difference between neder and nedava, neder hare alai, nedava hare zeh, right? Neder, I have to give. Nedava, this thing is, this animal is. But notice it mentions specifically anyone who gives a korban of a neder or of a nedava, asher yarkivu laHashem la'olah, that they will give to God as a burnt offering. Now, this is very interesting because you have at one and the same time a mention here of any neder they make, any nedava they make, which presumably should be able to include korban shlamim, korban mincha, right? But then at the end of the pasuk it says as an olah, as a burnt offering. So in Tannaitic literature, so far what we've seen is really the nidrehem and nidvota, right? It's they can give a neder or a nedava. That's what they're allowed to do. But what about this limiting term of olah? There's also another pasuk to notice that comes 7 psukim later. Pasuk Kaf Hey is an interesting pasuk to look at too, because that's also going to weigh into the conversation. Umiyan ben nechar lo takrivu et lechem Elohechem mikol ele. You shouldn't give a korban of the bread of your God from the hand of a non-Jew. Ki mashchatam bahem mum bam, because they are mutilated. They have some sort of defect. Lo yeratu lachem. They will not be accepted in your favor. Now, is this just saying you shouldn't accept an animal that has a mum, that has some sort of disqualifying wound or defect? Or is this saying anything you accept from a foreigner, and presumably we're talking about somebody who worships, who does pagan worship, that is considered something that is mutilated and you can't take it. And if you can't take it, what about the psukim above that said they're allowed to do a neder and a nedava, right? It's a little confusing. So let's look at some other Tannaitic literature that actually starts to recognize what becomes, well, here is where it becomes the machloka between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva as to what exactly are the parameters. Is it any neder or nedava? Is it any voluntary korban, which means it could even be a korban shlamim, it could even be a korban mincha, or is it only a korban olah as the end of the pasuk? And then what are we going to do with that pasuk cafe? But we'll get back to it. So the Tosefta in Shkalim, right? Tosefta, again, companion piece to the Mishnah, but includes some stuff that isn't in the Mishnah. Okay? Lochim min hagoyim korbanot tzibur bekesef. It's okay to buy an animal from non-Jews using money and then use that animal for a korban tzibur, for a public offering, like a korban tamid, for example, right? The daily offering. Additionally, umikablin mehen olot ushlamim, we actually accept from non-Jews if they want to give a korban olah, a fully burnt offering, or a korban shlamim, where part of it is eaten by the owners, or, by the way, ofot, if they want to give an offering, a bird offering, menachot, or if they want to give a korban mincha, right? If they want to give a flower offering, eitzim, if they want to donate wood to the mizbeach that we're to the Beit Hamikdash that we're going to use on the mizbeach, the altar, ulivona, frankincense, umelach, or if they want to donate salt. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili says we accept all of that. Now, why? He doesn't say, right? But let's see. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva says, no. Afilu ata yoshev v'dorish kol hayom, even if you try to expound the pasuk all day, and the pasuk that we're talking about is pasuk Yudchet from Vayikra Kavbet that we just looked at. Ein mekablin mehen ela ola u'shlamim bilvad. Nope. Only an ola or a shlamim. That's it. Only a fully burnt offering or a a peace offering. Now, well, ein mekablin mehen. I'm going to leave that there. Fine. So that's the Tosefta. So the way this is presented is Rabbi Yossi Aglili says pretty expansive. Now, of course, this doesn't include korbanot that are required, right? There's no required korbanot that they can give to here. And Rabbi Akiva says, nope, it's just olot and shlamim. Now, it could be, maybe for all we know, Rabbi Akiva is working off of olotehem v'zivchehem l'ratzono mizbechi, right? They're ola and zivchehem, presumably shlamim. Maybe. But when we look at Midrash Halakha, we get a little bit more of a picture of where their machloket may be coming from. But get ready because the positions have switched. It's Rabbi Akiva who's expansive and Rabbi Yosef Lili who narrows. So let's see. Okay, Lama Nemar, and of course there are definitely people who tried to figure out a way for all of them to be lined up so that the machloket is always the same person more expansive, the other person more narrow. But Lama Nemar ish ish, why does it say any person, right? Which is that pasuk Yudchet, and it had said ish ish mi Beit Yisrael, any person from Israel. Well, any person comes lahaviyat hagoyim, comes to include non-Jews. Shehem nodrin b'nidarim u'v'nidavot ki Yisrael. They're allowed to make voluntary korbanot to the Beit Hamikdash like a Jew. Well, asher yakriv l'Hashem la'olah. What about the end of the pasuk that said that they give as a burnt offering, or that one gives as a burnt offering? Ainli ela olah. I might think they're only allowed to give a korban olah, a burnt offering. Minayin l'rabotat hashlamim. How do I know they're also allowed to give a peace offering? Talmud lomar. It says nidrei hem. Right? Doesn't just say neder. It says nidrei hem, plural. Minayin et hatodah. How do I know that they can even bring a korban todah, a thanks offering, which is what we say gomel for these days? Talmud lomar nidvotam, right? Not just one type of nidava, not just one type of donation, but multiple, right? Minayin lirabot et haofot v'hamenachot v'hayayin v'alevona v'haitzim. What about those other things like bird offerings and flower offerings and wine and frankincense and wood? Talmud lomar. That's what it says. Nidrehem. It doesn't just say what they swear to bring, but it says lechol nidrehem, all of their swearings. Nidvotam, what they donate. No, lechol nidvotam, all of their, right? Meaning, so it's expansive. Im kain, if that's the case, lama ne'amar she'akrivu l'Hashem l'olah. Why does the pasuk end with they give an olah? Prat linizirut. It's trying to say they do not do the Nazirite korbanot, meaning they can't be a Nazir, they can't be a Nazirite. Why? Because a Nazir, when they finish, they give more korbanot than just an olah. Okay. Tivir Rabbi Akiva. That's Rabbi Akiva. So notice Rabbi Akiva is the expansive one, which, by the way, fits very much with Rabbi Akiva's approach, right? He's always being marbeh things. He's always adding based on a letter here or a word there. Amarle Rabbi Yosef Glili says, nope. Afilu atamar bekol hayom, even if you try to do ribuyim all day, even if you try to say nidvotam and nidrehem and lechol nidvotam, nope. Ein kan ela olah bilvad. Only a burnt offering is allowed, right? Now, interesting, just notice the difference between the Tosefta and this Midrash Halakha and Torat Kohanim, the Midrash Halakha on Vayikra. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says it's not Ein kan ela ola shlamim bilvad. He says Ein kan ela ola bilvad, just an ola, which to me, when I read it, that makes more sense to me, right? Meaning that read makes more sense to me because the end of the pasuk is just, it says ola. That's it. It says ola. So what we have here is we have the beginnings of a puncture in that very nice olotehem v'zivchehem l'ratzono mizbechi, right? They could bring ola, they could be anything, kol shenidar v'nidav, anything that can be donated, they may donate, right? So we have a hole's been punctured, right? It's possible that there are those who say, no, just olod shlamim. And then it's also possible that there are those who say, no, just ola, right? Because of that pasuk in Vayikra. And I want to think about the logic for a minute because I actually think this machloket is really quite fascinating. When we have a machloket about, when we have the possibility of just bringing an ola, right? Before we get to what the Gemara says, when we say, look, you can send a burnt offering, I think the impression that you get is really that the what you send it and then it's done. Meaning it goes fully on the mizbeach. It's not eaten by any kohanim. It's not eaten by you. It doesn't have any afterlife. It's kulol Hashem. It's just to God, but it doesn't become part of what is generally kind of the human involvement in consuming the product, right? Meaning if there's just Ola allowed, the logic is you're not actually part of the system of the Beit Hamikdash. You 100% can offer a korban, but the Beit HaMikdash system, in terms of people eating, consuming this, and sharing a meal with God, as it were, that's not what this is, right? So the sense of outsider status is maintained, right? Now, if you say, well, you can give anything that is donatable, right? Within the system, any type of korban that's donated. So you could give mincha, you give a wine libation, and that means you're going to eat part of it, the kohanim are going to eat part of it. Then I think in some ways you're letting people in more. And what you're saying is the difference in terms of the Beit HaMikdash, in terms of how a Jew engages with it and how someone who's not Jewish, is that the Beit HaMikdash is a place where Jews have obligations. It's a place where Jews are obligated and a place where non-Jews can opt in. But that sense of obligation, and I think the presumption of kapara, the presumption of atonement that comes with that, right? Obligated to give the korban tamid every day, obligated to give a korban when you sin, obligated to give a korban when you have a child, right? Meaning the sense of uh, korbanot being a steady part of obligation in one's life, that's for Jews only. Now let's see what our Gemara in Menachot said on Ayin Gimel. Starts on Ayin Bet. It starts, excuse me, on Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, goes to Ayin Gimel Amud Bet. Titania Ish, right? It says Ish. Ma Talmud Lomar Ish Ish. Why does it say any person, right? Vayikra Kaf Bet Yudchet. Lirabot et Hagoyim, to include non-Jews. Shenodrim Nidarim, excuse me, unedavot Yisrael, who can donate like a Jew. Asher yakrivu laHashem leolah, that they will give as an olah, as a burnt offering. Ainli ela olah, I know that they can give a burnt offering. Shlamim minayin, how do I know they can give a peace offering? Talmud lomar nidre hem, right? This is like the Torah Kohanim that we read. They're multiple oaths. Toda minayin, how do we know that they can give a Thanksgiving offering? Talmud lomar nidvotam. Again, more than one type of nidav. Minayin lerabot haufot v'ayayin v'alabona v'aitzim. How do I know that we can add all of these different things that they can also donate? Talmud lomar nidrehem lechol nidrehem. Right, the lechol nidvotam lechol nidvotam lechol. Im kain, if that's the case, ma Talmud lomar ola ola. Ma Talmud lomar ola. Why does it say ola at the end? Ola prat lenizirut. Right, the ola is going to mean that they can offer their burnt offering, but not the burnt offering or the other offerings of Nizirut. Tivri Rabbi Yossi Aglili. See, the positions have switched, right, from the Torah Kohanim. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, nope, Asher Krivu Lashem Lola, that they will give to God, they will bring close to God as a Ola, Ein Le'ela Ola Bovad. only an ola, right? So it's same as the Torah Kohanim, but the positions are switched. Now it's funny because on the one hand, Rabbi Akiva, he's the marbeh, right? He's the one who learns new ideas from each jot and tittle in the Torah, but he's also the one who is much more exclusive about Judaism and Jewish practice for Jews, right? He's the one who says Goy Shavat, a non-Jew who keeps Shabbat is chayav mita. He's the one who talks about chosenness in Pirkei Avot as, God gave us the Kli Chemda because we're so important. We're Banim Lashem as opposed to the school of Rabbi Ishmael, who seems to talk about chosenness as we are Kohanim, meaning we have a job to do, we have an obligation, as opposed to some inherent different status. And it's not that the Torah was given to us, it's that we were given to the Torah, right? So there's reason to think that Rabbi Akiva would be on both sides, right? And I just think it's quite interesting. The Gemara, of course, says, you learned it this week, the Gemara, of course, says that one of the reasons why you might say that a non-Jew can only give an olah is because Libola Shamayim, meaning the non-Jew who gives it doesn't expect Kohanim to be eating it and doesn't expect to be eating it themselves. They actually want it to go completely on the Mizbeach. They don't want it to be something that people eat. So that adds another layer. I forgot to include that here, but that adds another layer here too. But it really does, we are really left here with two different ways of thinking about the relationship of a non-Jew to the Beit Hamikdash. One is that it's sort of a kulo Hashem, meaning you give to God, but you're not part of the system at all. It has no afterlife. Another is you are a voluntary part of the system. You are not an obligatory part of the system. This is not part of the whoop and woof of your, is it whoop? Yeah, whoop and woof, woof, woof. I'm not sure. Woof and warp. I don't and somebody will fix it. Um, you're not part of that. Yeah, woof and warp. What a weird term. But that's not a consistent part of your lives. Now, I want to note something that's so counterintuitive and fascinating, which is if a non-Jew can give a korban olah according to everybody in the Mikdash. By the way, there are some later sources that suggest that they can't, and that's like a kind of a surprise and doesn't really follow any of the earlier materials and doesn't get a lot of traction. But I mean, there's no Beit Hamikdash, so it doesn't matter right now. But the point is, there's something interesting that emerges, namely, the a non-Jew can offer an olah. A non-Jew has no prohibition on what we call shchutei chutz, uh, offering a korban outside of the Beit Hamikdash. So conceivably, there could be a time where a non-Jew could give a korban and a Jew could not, right? And the Yerushalmi and Megillah, and this is what I want to end with, the Yerushalmi and Megillah talks about it. Hakol karev b'bama, if we're talking about a bama, meaning a bama is a private altar. I mean, it could be somewhat public, but it's a non-Beit HaMikdash altar. Anything can be given there, and it could be a behemoth, it could be a domesticated animal, it could be a wild animal, it could be birds, big or small. It doesn't just have to be the birds mentioned in the Torah. It could be male, it could be female, but you have to make sure that it doesn't have a mum, and it also still has to be a kosher animal. And Yerushalmi then says, "V'goyim b'zman hazeh rashi'in la'asot zeh." Non-Jews can do this today, meaning after the Beit HaMikdash, Jews are not allowed to build bamot anymore. After the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, non-Jews go build a bama, give a korban LaHashem. Why not? And Rabbi Abba, B'Shem Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Asur liYisrael sayo v'asur le'asot lo shaliach. A Jew is forbidden to help them build it, right? Because for a Jew, this would be Isser Bamot. For a Jew, this would be Shchutei Chutz. And you also can't be their emissary, meaning if they say, oh, I don't know how to give a korban for me, say, I can't really do that, right? So here, the non-Jew can give the korban, but the Jew cannot, right? And actually, there's a great Gemara in the Bavli and Zvachim for people who remember Kuftet Zayin, and it goes like this, okay? I'm a rabba. I'll actually, one second. I'm skipping just for time. Okay, kiha de Ifra Hormiz, Ime de Shavar Malka. So Ifra Hormiz, who was the mother of King Shapur, who was a Zoroastrian king, who was pretty good to the Jews. Shadra Korbana Rava. She sent a korban to Rava. Shalchale, and she said to him, Askuanele l'shem shamayim. I want you to give it as a korban for the sake of heaven. Now, Rava can't do this. He's not allowed to build a bama. He's not allowed to do shchutei. He can't do this. Amr lahu l'Rav Safra l'Rav Acha bar Huna. So he says to two rabbis, Zilu udvaru trei ulme golai. Go get two young men, okay? V'chazo hecha demaska yama sirton, okay? And you know, sorry, second. And make sure that it's, I'll put it like this, this is done in a special place. Ushkuli tzive chadate, and bring out new, you know, uh, uh, wood, va'apiku nura mimara chadata, and bring out, fire from new vessels, va'asku anele l'shem shamayim. And those two men will give the korban for the sake of heaven. Meaning he's basically saying, okay, I'm not allowed to do this, but we can teach you to do this, right? So to me, this is just a fascinating concept that when the Beit Hamikdash was around, a non-Jew could give a korban olah, but Jews were really doing the maximal engagement with korbanot. But after the Beit Hamikdash is destroyed, it's non-Jews who are allowed to give the korban l'shem Hashem on a bama, and Jews may not, but Jews can help instruct them in how it could be done. So I will leave you with that ironic, strange, interesting food for thought. Thanks, everyone.